extraordinary selflessness and professionalism on behalf of the United States and our state's unified condolences and grief for the families of the 4 killed in action, and our hope for a swift recovery for the nearly 100 wounded over the last 2 weeks. And thank you to you for your service to the nation. Mr. Hegseth, you're requesting roughly $68 billion for the department through this supplemental, correct?
67, yes.
And yesterday, your department stated publicly, quote, U.S. forces struck Iranian military command centers, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, and air defense systems to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking commercial vessels. That was a press release from your department. Is that a broadly accurate characterization of ongoing operations?
That sounds broadly accurate, yes.
On day 14 of this conflict, Mr. Secretary, day 14, nearly 5 months ago, you stated that Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and, quote, made combat ineffective. That was on day 14 of the war. Was that an accurate statement?
They didn't have a Navy any longer. It was completely sunk. Their missiles were buried underneath a lot of their underground facilities, and their defense industrial base has been almost completely destroyed. So as far as a military assessment of Iran's capabilities, it didn't mean by any stretch of the imagination absolute zero, but their capabilities at the lowest level
you stated
very
that
long time.
On day 14 of this conflict, in the second week of the conflict, you stated that Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and, quote, made combat ineffective. Was that an accurate statement? Yes or no?
Iran's ability to challenge the United States of America at the level at which we're capable of.
That's not what I asked you, Mr. Secretary. You said on day 14 Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and, quote, made combat ineffective. Yes or no, was that an accurate statement?
What the American military has done to the
question?
Iranian military is a historic military
Will you
defeat,
answer the
and
question
they're ineffective
under oath?
in that context.
3 weeks later, you declared victory. That was now nearly 4 months ago. 3 weeks after you'd already said Iran's military was destroyed and combat ineffective, you said, quote, Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory. You said Iran's military had been rendered, quote, combat ineffective for years to come. And you stated we had, quote, achieved every single objective. Were those accurate statements?
It certainly was, on behalf of the men and women in uniform, a historic military victory over Iran.
Had Iran's military been rendered, quote, combat ineffective for years to come? That was a statement that you made 4 months ago.
They had 160 naval vessels
in the Blue Water Navy,
and they're gone. Their Air Force is completely combat ineffective, and they don't have a defense industrial base. So describe to me a country that doesn't have an Air Force, a Navy, or a defense industrial base, and I will describe to you a country that does not have an effective military. It can lob missiles.
Mr. Secretary, you stated 4 months ago that Iran's military had been rendered, quote, combat ineffective for years to come. Has Iran's military been, for the last 4 months, combat ineffective?
It's been set back not just years, but likely decades.
You stated we had, quote,
build at the level it did before, not even close. It doesn't mean it doesn't have capabilities.
Mr. Secretary, you stated we had, quote, achieved every single objective. Was that an accurate statement 4 months ago?
The main objective of this was to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Their main sites were obliterated. We're watching over them, and we're holding them at issue. If they don't give them up at the table, there's other ways we can take them away.
Early in the conflict
Iran will
on
never
day
have a
3,
nuclear
Mr.
weapon.
Secretary, early in the conflict, day 3, you said one of those core objectives was to, quote, destroy the missile threat, and as you restated on day 5, to, quote, obliterate Iran's missiles and drones. Those were clearly and repeatedly stated core objectives of the campaign, which 4 months ago you declared had been completed victoriously with every single objective achieved. Were those objectives achieved 4 months ago?
No one ever stated that every single missile was gone. Ultimately, combat ineffective means they're not able to dig them out of their UGFs and shoot at us.
Had the missile threat
It doesn't mean they don't have underground
4 months
facilities
ago?
where they put missiles in them and hold on to them because they're the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. So we never expected they would stop having capabilities to shoot. The question is at scale against an opponent like the United States of America, which went toe-to-toe with them and Iran couldn't.
You stated on March 8th, day 9 of the war, on 60 Minutes, you assured the American people of Iranian surrender. Does that remain your prediction?
Ultimately, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon to threaten the United States of America. That has been the objective, and it remains so.
So just to review, you will not answer whether your statement made on the 14th day of the war that Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and made combat ineffective was a truthful statement to the American people as you sit here and ask for tens of billions more for the conflict.
Senator's time has
Had a
expired.
historic and effective military campaign against the largest state sponsor of terrorism.
Won't answer the question.
Senator Peters.
What happens when the man overseeing an active military campaign is asked to stand by the exact phrases he used months earlier while requesting tens of billions more in funding? That question hung in the air the moment Ossoff began quoting Hegseth's own earlier statements about the conflict with Iran and refused to let the answers stay vague. On the 14th day of the campaign, known as Operation Epic Fury, Hegseth had told the public that Iran's military had been destroyed and made combat ineffective. The language was clear and confident. 3 weeks after that assessment, he stood before cameras again and declared an overwhelming victory, stating that every single objective had been achieved and that Iran's forces had been rendered combat ineffective for years to come. Those were the words Ossoff placed back in front of him. The senator asked a simple yes or no question. Was that an accurate statement? Hegseth responded by speaking about the historic military victory achieved on behalf of the men and women in uniform. He emphasized that Iran's ability to challenge the United States at scale had been fundamentally altered. Ossoff repeated the original phrasing and pressed again for a direct answer on whether the Day 14 claim remained truthful. The secretary continued to frame the earlier assessments in the broader context of a campaign that had degraded Iran's capacity and set back its military-industrial base by decades. The exchange revealed a clear gap between the triumphant language used in the early weeks and the reality of an ongoing operation that still required substantial additional resources. By the time of the July hearing, the administration was seeking an $87.6 billion supplemental package with a majority earmarked for continued operations. Hegseth told the committee the conflict had already cost $37.5 billion and that American lives had been lost in the process. Those figures sat uneasily beside the earlier declarations of decisive success. Hegseth defended the original statements by arguing that while Iran retained some residual ability to launch missiles, its capacity to operate as a coherent military force capable of large-scale challenge had been crippled. He maintained that the objectives laid out at the start remained the focus and that the campaign had delivered measurable results against air defense's naval assets and the defense industrial base. Ossoff noted for the record that the secretary would not directly confirm or walk back the specific language used on Day 14, while simultaneously asking Congress for tens of billions more. The tension in the room reflected larger questions that have followed the conflict since its early phase. When public assessments declare a military destroyed, and then months later the same leadership returns seeking major new funding, the public is left away how those earlier claims should be understood. Independent cost estimates have varied, with some analyses placing the overall expense higher than the figure presented in the hearing. Casualty numbers, though relatively limited compared to the scale of the operation, have also become part of the political conversation. Throughout the questioning, Hegseth returned to the theme of American service members and the results they achieved with limited overall combat power. He described the early strikes as having dismantled significant portions of Iran's military infrastructure and argued that the residual threats did not change the fundamental shift in the balance. Ossoff kept the focus on accountability for the precise wording that had been delivered to the American people at the time. The senator framed the issue as one of transparency, especially when further taxpayer resources were being requested. Other voices in the hearing raised related concerns about strategy costs and domestic priorities. The discussion touched on the continued disruption in the region, including effects on shipping routes and energy markets that have been felt by American consumers. Hegseth pushed back against characterizations of the campaign as unsuccessful, insisting that the core mission of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear capability remained on track. The hearing did not produce a moment in which the secretary fully adopted or fully rejected the earlier vocabulary of total destruction and permanent combat ineffectiveness. Instead, it produced a careful restatement of results achieved alongside an acknowledgement that some capabilities persisted. That careful positioning has itself become part of the story. Viewers and commentators have noted how the exchange left the original statements open to interpretation while the funding request moved forward. As the session continued, the contrast between the bold public messaging of March and April and the measured congressional testimony of July stayed front and center. Ossoff's questioning style stayed methodical, repeating the quotes and returning to the yes or no format. Hegseth's replies stayed focused on the broader strategic picture and the performance of the forces involved. The result was a public record in which the earlier language was placed under sustained examination without a clean resolution. This kind of confrontation matters because wartime messaging shapes public understanding of success, cost, and necessity. When a defense secretary announces that a military has been destroyed and later returns to explain why substantial new resources are still required, the sequence invites closer examination of how assessments are formed and communicated. The July hearing placed that sequence in plain view. Hegseth maintained that the campaign had delivered a historic outcome for the men and women who executed it, and that Iran's ability to threaten at scale had been reduced for years. Ossoff maintained that the American people deserved a clear answer on whether the specific claims made in real time had been accurate. Both positions remain on the record. The funding request and the continued operations mean the practical consequences of those positions will continue to unfold. The exchange also highlighted how quickly the language of victory can meet the language of ongoing need. 4 months after the declaration of overwhelming success, the same leadership was describing a conflict that had already consumed tens of billions and still required more. That timeline alone has prompted discussion about the reliability of early battlefield assessments and the political incentives that can shape them. Supporters of the campaign point to the scale of damage inflicted on Iranian air defenses, missile production, and industrial capacity as evidence that the early claims were grounded in real results. Critics focus on the persistence of Iranian responses, the human and financial costs, and the gap between the rhetoric of finality and the reality of continued engagement. The hearing did not settle that debate. It simply made the terms of the debate sharper and more public. As the committee moved on to other questions, the core tension introduced by Ossoff remained. A secretary who had spoken with certainty about destruction and years of ineffectiveness was now explaining residual capabilities and the need for sustained resources. The American public was left to decide how much weight to give each set of statements and what standard of accountability should apply when those statements are made in the middle of a live conflict. The July session added another chapter to a story that began with rapid early claims of decisive success and has continued through rising costs and persistent challenges. Whether the original language holds up under the weight of later events is a question the hearing placed squarely in front of anyone watching.